We are talking The Rebels. Those rebel scum. This one is directed and written by Emmett Cummings. Now this focuses on 4 rebellious teenagers in the 1st century Roman occupied Wales, and they must flee for their lives after they accidentally kill a Roman soldier. Now before this, our 4 teenagers are just typical teenagers, very akin to teenagers in this modern day, just hanging around, chatting, fantasising kind of about where their lives are going, causing trouble. But one day they accidentally kill this kind of soldier after he threatens one of their group, and then they have to go on the run. It's focused. We have these 4 teenagers, 3 of which are guys, 1 of which is this kind of young girl, and they having to survive out in the wilderness, in the woods, very much like your Red Dawn kind of set up to a certain degree. So it's Red Dawn in 1st century Roman occupied Britain, and the Romans, of course, want to push back and find these kind of quote unquote rebels, as they have now ignited a conflict between the local populace and the presiding kind of Roman garrison that is stationed there. And this obviously is flaring up and kind of violence is erupting. So that's your kind of your basic setup for the movie. So it's a low budget British movie, and it's very much a coming of age tale. This is almost like a you can kind of take the Roman conflict out of it. And the majority of the movie is actually spent on a sort of coming of age tale. These 4 teenagers having to grow up and deal with kind of the consequences of their actions, and you know, their interpersonal kind of relationships as well, which we discover their kind of relationships with each other are going to change throughout the course of this movie. And that's really actually the focus of the film, if we're being honest. The actual conflict of the Romans, so to speak, is actually kind of pushed to the side until really the last kind of act of this movie, where it's kind of like caught up again. So what works for me in this film, I have to say, the Roman occupied Britain is very well realised here. It's very gritty. It's kind of like not at all kind of has this kind of like Hollywood sheen. I mean, it's a low budget kind of like, you know, film, but nonetheless I did feel it does kind of give you a kind of a grimy and gritty look at kind of 1st century life in Britain, with kind of no real kind of like Hollywood pizzazz over this one. It just kind of looks like lots of kind of mud and huts and stuff like that, and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, etc. So I actually quite like this. And now I actually thought our acting as well was actually pretty good. Our 4 teens, or young adults, I think one of them's a little older, do a pretty good job here of portraying kind of real teenagers. Now, I don't know how historically accurate the language is, because they kind of seem like teenagers now, but just dressed in kind of like rags. But nonetheless, I thought they did a good job. But I wonder how much of this is real acting and they're just kind of more playing versions of themselves to a certain degree. However, whatever the reason, what we see on screen, I've got to say, I didn't think the acting was too bad here. And props too to the kind of the costume department and the kind of the props. They all look pretty good, and our kind of Roman kind of soldiers all look very kind of authentic and stuff like that. There's one quite exciting battle sequence towards the end, where we have a kind of a mass Roman versus kind of Britain smackdown that I thought was actually pretty good and quite exciting. Yeah, I mean, I actually kind of quite liked some of the characters here. The characters are quite well realised, and you do kind of get to know these 4 teens pretty well by the end of the movie. It doesn't work for me. As much as I like the characterisation of these 4 teenagers, I do feel this movie is treading water big time, especially in the first hour. Because outside of the inciting incident, we do feel that this movie is very much kind of like spinning its wheels with very little plot development. Now, I feel part of that is because it's a low budget film. They don't have the budget to kind of stretch out to have a lot of set pieces. So the first hour is primarily kind of these 4 teenagers in the woods and dealing with kind of personal kind of relationships and problems. And it's a coming of age tale with those type of things, just like we have in this day and age. That's all well and good, but it kind of really slows the film down, and you feel like you needed some type of greater scale to it to really move the plot forwards, because you do feel like it is just kind of repeat, you know, just kind of like going through the motions ultimately. I have to say, some of the kind of the choice, the story beats here as well, For example, when we have this one action sequence, this one kind of big battle sequence, and I didn't like the way that was introduced because our teams just seem to stumble into it. There's no actual, they just seem to kind of happen across it. And the Romans are fighting some other people who I'm assuming are to do with this rebellion, but it's never really kind of said. And they just kind of fall into it, really, and it's just a bit weird. So there's kind of this big rebellion kind of I felt needed to be a little bit more sort of set up, because we only ever really see it from these kind of teens' point of view, and they just seem to kind of like it's all happenstance, really. And I don't even know if that was 100% connected to all the actual plot, if I'm honest. They just seem to fall into this battle, and you know they kind of get ignored by Roman soldiers. I don't know, it didn't really work for me to a certain degree in the way that was written. It kind of, hand in hand with that, I felt like the Roman soldiers seemed like they were made of eggshells, because they just seemed to go down so easily compared to, I mean, these are trained Roman soldiers with armour against kind of peasants with no combat experience. But they just seem to get on like complete bitches, if I'm completely honest. And we have one scene where one of our characters throws a stick and hits a Roman in the head with it, who's wearing a helmet, and kills him straight. And yeah, it's just a bit silly, but that's not the only instance. It just seems like the Romans, you can blow on them and they'll kind of like, they'll keel over and die, with the exception of our kind of one main bad guy Roman that kind of pursues him, who seems to be a little bit more hardy at least. But even so, you know, there's a scene where he kind of faces off against one of the teams, and it's like, again, he's a military guy with armour and training, and he's fighting a teenager, and it's kind of like, the end, you know, that kind of where that ends up, I don't know, it's just a little silly, really. It's kind of, it goes into kind of a fantasy almost element to it, and kind of comes away from any type of realism. So you would really look at this as a kind of historical fantasy rather than a, you know, historical film, if that makes sense. The budget here is a little bit kind of affecting, because you feel like this is not particularly cinematic. There is, the way it's filmed, it feels like a TV drama, not a film. So what I mean by that, you have a lot of kind of like tight angles, a lot of kind of close-ups, and a lot of just kind of conversations that are filmed, and it doesn't feel like a film. You feel like you're watching some type of, you know, like just a TV episode of something, you know, or a TV sort of special or something, because it just doesn't feel particularly cinematic. There's not a lot of kind of wide shots here. There's no real kind of sense of scale. It's just a very kind of small, intimate story, you know, which is fine for what it is. But, you know, if you're expecting more of a cinematic experience, I mean, this is partly down to the budget, but also I think some of the choices in regards to the cinematography, it lacks a little bit because of that. So overall, I do think this movie has some good elements here. I kind of like the kind of the down-to-earth kind of boots on the ground style look at you know, Roman occupation. That was quite fun. From obviously, again, from a kind of a teenagers, villagers kind of perspective, was quite interesting. But I don't think the movie was particularly exciting and particularly engaging. And I felt the story was a bit kind of treading water in that first kind of 2 acts, really. So we'll give it a 4 out of 10, slightly below average for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.